Okay, so here we have airway pressure release ventilation, also known as bi-level ventilation. I believe another name is bi-vent for it. Pretty interesting mode of ventilation that utilizes two levels of pressure, okay, to ventilate the patient. So if I take a look at this, I see that I have a P low, which is pretty much synonymous with a peak level, and a P high. The person can breathe spontaneously at the P high or the P low. Usually the way this is set up is your P high is a lot longer of a time than your P low, and therefore the person won't breathe at the P low, they'll only spontaneously breathe at the P high. So what happens is during the P high time, the person will go from P low to P high. When that occurs, we'll see a flow rate that decelerates like any pressure-controlled breath. Volume will be delivered while that pressure gradient's established. When we're on the P high time, the person can breathe spontaneously. Here they inhale and they exhale. And therefore I see a flow pattern that's sinusoidal, because this is a spontaneous breath. And then on top of that volume that was already delivered by the change in pressure, I see that I have more volume delivery because the person's breathing on top of the volume that was given with this first pressure gradient. So if I look down at the volume scaler, I see that I have a little bit more volume being delivered on top of the volume that was already delivered. And then that volume comes back out because the person actually exhales, shown here in the pressure scaler and here in the flow scaler. So that little bit of volume that they breathed on top of the volume that was previously delivered comes back out. At the end of the P high time, that pressure gradient goes from P high to P low, so I see expiratory flow, and I see the volume coming back out. Now, the way that APRV is used is you should set it up so that you actually trap gas in the lungs, because this is actually a mode of ventilation used for oxygenation. So we don't want all the alveoli to close. We don't want them to de-recruit. So when we go from P high to P low, the person starts to exhale, but you'll see that the person doesn't exhale all the way back to baseline. We re-establish P high before the person exhales all the gas that was given into their lungs from the previous breath. Therefore, if I look at my volume scaler, you see that my volume scaler resets to 0 because the next breath begins. So that volume never actually made it all the way back out into the patient's lungs. The flow rate never decelerated all the way back to baseline. And this is why a person generally will not breathe at the P low level, because you simply just don't give them enough time. They can breathe at the P low level, but they usually won't if you set it up in this inverse ratio. This second breath, I just demonstrated the person didn't breathe spontaneously. It looks identical to a pressure-controlled breath, doesn't it? In which the pressure level goes from the low to the high, the flow rate decelerates to 0, and the volume stays in until the end of that I time, in which the person exhales and the volume comes back out. This third breath re-illustrates the first point. P high is established. You have a decelerating flow pattern. This person breathes twice spontaneously on top of that P high. They have two sinusoidal flow patterns, giving them volume in, volume out, volume in, volume out on top of the volume that was already delivered. Okay, and then at the end of the P high, it comes down and he exhales. On this last breath, I've added 10 of pressure support, because we can add pressure support with any mode of ventilation that allows for spontaneous breathing, and obviously airway pressure release ventilation does allow for spontaneous breathing. So here I've added 10 of pressure support. So if I were to bring this over to my graphics package, I would see that the peak inspiratory pressure now is 30, which would be dangerously close to an alveolar pressure of 30. But for illustration points, it'll do just fine. So here on P high, the patient starts to inhale a spontaneous breath, triggers that pressure-supported breath. The pressure-supported breath goes up to the pressure level, stays at that pressure level, until the flow rate decelerates to the terminal flow sensitivity, and then that pressure-supported breath shuts off, which gives me expiratory flow here, which shows me the volume coming back from that pressure-supported breath, until the end of my P high time, in which the volume that was delivered here now is exhaled here, and it comes back out here. So to classify this mode of ventilation gets kind of messy. You can say that the P high time is time triggered. The P low time, therefore, is, the P high time is therefore time cycled. But you got to be careful when you start talking about these as breaths, because we also have breaths that are occurring on the P high and the P low time. So I guess you could say airway pressure release ventilation is time triggered into P high and time cycled into P low. Spontaneous breathing can occur at both levels, and if pressure support is added, therefore pressure support is patient triggered, pressure limited flow cycle ventilation. In a nutshell, the patient is allowed to breathe spontaneously at two different pressure levels, and pressure support can be added to boost those spontaneous volumes. And if it's set up correctly, the P high time will be a lot longer than the P low time, because that's what we're currently using this mode of ventilation for. We're using it for a lung protective strategy.
Okay.
So here we have the mode CPAP with tenant PEEP. I've drawn a pressure time scaler, a flow time scaler, and a volume time scaler to explain this mode of ventilation. On the pressure time scaler, I started my baseline off at plus 10, which correlates with the 10 of PEEP that I'm trying to explain. The baseline at 10, you see that the baseline drops during inspiration because the person is inhaling, and therefore that pressure can't stay perfectly at 10 in the circuit. And as the patient exhales, you see the pressure go up a little bit. And therefore we have three different breaths here being demonstrated, with inspiratory pressure going down and expiratory pressure coming back up. If we take a look at the flow pattern during these spontaneous breaths, you see that we have a sinusoidal flow pattern on inspiration. Now I've drawn these purposefully so that they're not perfectly linear, because here the person is just spontaneously breathing at this elevated baseline. We normally will cause an inspiratory flow pattern to be sinusoidal. Okay, we start off at 0, flow will increase, and then flow will decrease back to 0 until the end of the breath. So here we have an inspiratory flow pattern that correlates with inspiration on the pressure time scaler, another inspiratory flow pattern, and then a third inspiratory flow pattern. If I take a look at the way that these things line up, the inspiratory flow pattern begins with a drop in pressure and ends with the increase in circuit pressure, which would be expiration. Volume down on my volume time scaler, I would see the volume going in during the beginning of the inspiration. Volume would continue to go into my patient until inspiration was done, signified here and here by my pressure and flow scalers, and then the volume comes back out. Volumes can vary depending upon how much the person's inhaling. Flow can vary depending upon how hard the person is pulling. But my pressure scaler should stay right around my PEEP level, because the ventilator will open and close those inspiratory and expiratory valves. Therefore, if I were to explain this, there's nothing really to trigger, there's nothing to limit, and there's nothing to cycle, because there's no breaths to describe. This is simply a patient breathing at an elevated baseline. Okay, so here I've drawn a pressure time, a flow time, and a volume time scaler for you in the mode of CPAP with 5 of PEEP and 15 of pressure support. If I take a look at the pressure time scaler first, you see that I have my baseline pressure at 5, and the baseline pressure stayed the same until the patient started to inhale. So a pressure supported breath is only patient triggered. When the patient triggered the breath, the pressure went to a certain pressure level, in my case 15 centimeters of pressure support, above the baseline pressure. So this pressure is actually at 20, okay, because that would give me 15 centimeters of pressure. After the patient triggered it, the pressure support level went to that pressure support level, stayed at that pressure support level, until the flow rate decelerated to a predetermined point, usually called your terminal flow rate or your terminal sensitivity. So the breath was initiated by the patient The breath went to a pressure level, stayed at the pressure level until the flow rate decelerated, and then when the flow rate decelerated to this terminal sensitivity, the patient exhaled. The next breath, the patient triggers. It goes to the preset pressure support level. The flow rate decelerates to that terminal point, and then the patient is allowed to exhale. The third breath, something interesting happens. The patient triggers the breath. The pressure goes to the pressure support level, but if you notice, the flow rate doesn't decelerate all the way down to my terminal sensitivity point, okay, or my terminal flow rate point, or the point that the ventilator cycles the pressure support off. This would be the case with a leak in the system, or possibly a leak around the tube. In that case, pressure support has a backup limiting mechanism that says, hey, it shouldn't take this long to cycle me off, therefore I have a time limit that will turn this breath off after a certain period of time. If I take a look at the volumes that were delivered, the first breath, the patient triggered it, went to the pressure support level, flow rate started out high, slowed down, and volume was being delivered. When the flow rate decelerated to this point, the patient exhaled, and therefore the volume came back out. Second breath was a little breath, patient triggered, went to the preset pressure support level, flow rate decelerated, volume went in, volume came back out. Third breath, I only have volume going in, because it's going in and probably leaking out of the circuit. And then when the pressure support limits itself with that time limit, you never see volume coming back out. Therefore, you don't see the volume waveform coming back in. So if you were to classify pressure support, you would say it is patient triggered, pressure limited, flow cycled ventilation with a backup time limit. In layman's terms, whenever the patient triggers the breath is given a pressure boost, which gives me a little bit more volume compared to if my patient was just breathing spontaneously at an elevated baseline, such as I would see with simply CPAP with +5 of pressure or of PEEP. Okay, here we're talking about pressure control, assist control. I tried to make my pressure scalars all the same, but I'm sloping away a little bit here, so I apologize about that. But my settings for this mode of ventilation are 25/5. So here you see in the first breath, the breath comes along and it is time triggered. It goes to the inspiratory pressure level and it stays at that inspiratory pressure level for the set I time. At the end of that set I time, it cycles off into expiration. The next breath, the patient tries to trigger. He triggers it. It goes up to the set pressure level for the set I time, and then he exhales. The third pressure's time scaler shows another time trigger that goes up to the set pressure level, stays there for the set I time, and exhales. If I look at the flow time scaler at the same time, you see that the beginning of the flow rate begins with the beginning of the pressure change. Initially, I get a lot of flow because I have a big gradient between the pressure that's in my ventilator and the pressure that's in my lungs. As my lungs fill up to this pressure, which I can't really see by looking at these graphics, but I can understand it in theory, as my lung pressure increases to the set pressure, the flow between those 2 points decelerates. At this point in my flow time scaler, I see that the flow is at 0. So I know at this point, my lungs are at the same pressure that my ventilator is set at. So my alveolar pressure right here is 25. And that's why there's no flow going in anymore. The flow rate stays at 0 until the end of the I time, and then the patient exhales. If I look down here, I see that the volume went in. All the volume that was going to go in went in at this point when the flow rate zeroed, stayed in until the end of the I time, and then the volume came back out. My second breath, I tried to demonstrate that the flow doesn't have to zero before the end of the I time. Right? In this case, the patient triggered it, went to the pressure level, stayed at the pressure level for the set I time. The flow rate started off high, decelerated. There was still flow going in, and there was still volume being delivered when the I time said shut off. And so at that point, the volume came back out, the patient exhaled, and the pressure dropped back down to my baseline pressure. My third breath here is essentially the same as my first breath, in which it's a time-triggered breath. It goes to the pressure level for the set I time. The flow rate rapidly decelerates to 0. showing that my alveolar pressure must be set, or must be at my pressure control level at this point. My alveolar pressure is at 25 right here, and therefore my volume that's being delivered has already been delivered at that point during the inspiratory cycle. The pressure stays at that level, the volume stays in until the end of the I time and the patient exhales. So that'd be the technical description of it. You know, if I were to classify it, I would say pressure control assist control is either patient or time triggered, pressure limited, time cycled ventilation. Okay? In layman's terms, I set a pressure level, I set a rate. If the patient doesn't breathe over the set rate, they will get that pressure level at that set rate. If the patient breathes over the set rate, they get that pressure level at the set I time.